Welcome everyone to Cannexus21. My name is Tony Botello and I'm coming to you from my home on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It is my sincere privilege to be serving as host for today's keynote address with Dr. Kris Magnusson. Prior to getting to the address, there are a few housekeeping items that I am contractually obligated to share with you, so I will start with those first. For chat and any questions you might have, please feel free to send your questions or comments through the chat feature. The chat function is on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a specific question, please preface the question by typing the letter Q in front of it. This will help me distinguish your questions from more general comments. All questions for Dr. Magnusson will be answered in the final 15 minutes of the session. And if you experience any technical difficulties during the session, please go to the support button on the home page or on your navigation bar. All right, and now it's time to introduce our speaker. Dr. Kris Magnusson recently completed 2 terms as Dean of the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University and has returned to faculty life as a professor. He has worked in the career development field since 1980, receiving the Province of Alberta Career Development Award of Excellence and the 2006 Stu Conger Award for Leadership in Career Development. He was also a co-founder of the Canadian Research Working Group for Evidence-Based Practice. Prior to joining SFU, Kris was a junior high school teacher, a college counselor, and a faculty member in counseling psychology at the Universities of Calgary and Lethbridge. Personally, it is a real treat to be able to introduce Kris, as there's many similarities in our lives. We are both at Simon Fraser University, work in career development, and our spouses both work in public health. And of course, we're both past runners-up of People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. In addition to all this, Kris has been an incredible source of knowledge and support for myself and the team at SFU Career and Volunteer Services. And I'm so looking forward to his talk and honored to facilitate the discussion afterwards. So with that, I now pass the floor, screen, whatever this is, to Dr. Kris Magnusson.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tony, for that engaging and interesting introduction. I hadn't known about the Sexiest Man Alive part, so that's news to me. Appreciate that. I too am very pleased to be with you today, and actually want to thank you for taking time to join in the conference in this way. I speak to you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Coquitlam, the Squamish, and the Musqueam nations. I think that we're able to gather in this way is really a tribute to the resilience and adaptability in the face of change. And isn't that really kind of a cool metaphor for our work as career development practitioners? That's what we do every day, is helping people deal with either expected or often very unexpected changes. But I'm also aware that this medium of technology distributed talk has potential to be interrupted. We could have internet service interruptions, computer glitches. You could have kids that need your attention, and any number of things that could interrupt our process here. So I thought maybe what I should do is just start by giving you the conclusion in case you need to step out somewhere. So here's the big hairy conclusion that I hope to work our way to. And that is that for far too long, our practice has been hamstrung by an over-reliance on information and decision strategies. And that we need to spend more of our time attending to the perceptions and emotions that people bring to the situation if we want to help them to prepare for an unpredictable future. So there's the big, hairy conclusion. Here's the title for the talk, was Working with and Around Emotions. And as soon as I started preparing for that, I realized that I couldn't effectively talk about the emotional component without talking about the linkage to the perceptual component. And so I've done a modest change to the title. So it's now Working with Perception and Emotions. A quick fact to just to ease your mind when I talk about an over-reliance on information. Information is a good thing. Our industry, our career helping industry, was built on the foundation of Parsons' work over 100 years ago. And he talked about 3 core processes that we need to use to help people. One is to help people have a clear understanding of themselves. And out of that dictum arose a massive industry in self-information, interest inventories, testing movement, all designed to give better information about the person. And the second piece that Parson talked about was information about the world of work. And that has also led to a massive investment in most governments in the Western world have invested in providing accurate labor market information. And when you put these 2 things together, information about self together with information about the world of work, and apply a reasoning process to it, the hope is that we can help people make good matches to a future for themselves. And we even did a study. We were asked to do a study to prove the impact of labor market information. And we thought that was kind of an odd request, but we worked with some employment centers in Saskatchewan and Brunswick. And sure enough, we found that labor market information has a positive impact on the majority of people who receive it. There is a caveat though. One is that it has to be timely information. The second is that it has to be accurate information. And third, and most importantly, it has to be linked to the client needs. So a form of triage at the beginning of an intervention is really important for that information to have value. So I'm not disputing how good information is, but there is a problem. And that is that information in and of itself is neutral. But perceptions and emotions have a huge distorting effect on information. Perceptions and their more deeply embedded cousins known as beliefs were an important part of one of the giants in our field, John Crumboltz, who talked about the importance of SOGs and WVGs. So SOGs were self-observation generalizations, things that people believe to be true about themselves. And WVGs are worldview generalizations, things that people perceive to be true about the world around them. Whether they're self-observation or worldview generalizations, they carry with them an emotional overlay. And taken together, these perceptions and emotions have a way of distorting, skewing, or totally ignoring information that people are presented with. Now, before I get too much further into it, I want to address an assumption that I think is quite prevalent in our practice. That's not really an assumption, but even in the brand for new, soon to be released Pan-Canadian Career Development Professional Competency Framework, the #1 item in the competencies is to deliver services within the scope of practice. And the assumption that I have found that a lot of people have is that emotion-focused work sits outside of a career practitioner's scope of practice. And I'd like to turn that on its head. In fact, what I'd really like to do is just get rid of that thing altogether and replace it with a different assumption. And that assumption is that working with client emotion is not only within practitioner's scope of practice, it is an ethical obligation that we do so. So let's start taking a little bit deeper look then at this perception emotion connection. Ultimately, when we're doing work with clients in career development, it's about sense making. It's about helping them make sense of their situation, make sense of where they're at, make sense of what the future might hold for them. And it goes without saying, I suppose, that how you make sense of things depends on how you look at things. And I've come to understand that there are 5 common career perception problems. perception problems that get in the way of being able to receive information, of being able to link information of self and world of work into positive actions. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these 5 career perception problems. I'm sure that if you've spent 10 minutes on the internet, you would have seen this picture at some point, showcasing the kitten looking in the mirror and seeing a ferocious lion. We have a 4.5-pound Yorkie in our house, and that Yorkie looks in the mirror and is absolutely convinced that she is a ferocious guard dog capable of ripping the limbs off anybody who would dare to come near her family. But it brings out, I think, a really important theme that we should be aware of, and that is that visibility does not equal shared meaning. Just because we have put similar information out doesn't mean that our clients are seeing that information or understanding that information the way that we do. So if we keep that as our core theme, that just because we've given clear, accurate, and timely information does not mean the client is seeing it that way, let's tie into these 5 perception problems. And to illustrate them, I'm going to show you some very old diagrams that came out of the Gestalt School of Psychology. And you may have seen these before, but if you have your chat feature enabled, I'm going to show you a picture, and then I just want you to look at it and see what you, record what you think you see. There's 3 of them. Here's the first. What do you see when I show you that? And the second. Now what do you see when I show you that? And the third. What do you see? So these 3 images bring me to my first career perception problem, and that is the tendency, the natural instinctual response of the brain to take data and form a pattern, even if you don't have complete data. Now, in each of the 3 pictures I showed you, the pattern wasn't complete. You had incomplete data, but most of you were able quickly to see a picture of a man because you filled in the blanks. Most of you were quickly able to see a picture of a dog, but some of you may have struggled with that 3rd picture. But not only is there a perceptual process where your brain is hardwired to take data points and form a picture, form a pattern, but there's an emotional attachment to it. Perhaps you felt fairly certain when you saw the picture of the man. Perhaps you gained confidence by the time you saw the picture of the dog. Hey, I've done 2 of these. I can do this stuff. I'm doing pretty good at this. But then when I showed you the picture, the 3rd picture, you may have had more trouble seeing the pattern. And it's a horse and rider. It's a picture of a horse and rider, and it has about the same amount of physical data. It's just rearranged differently. But you may have had a different emotional response to the horse and rider picture. You may have felt puzzled if you couldn't see a picture right away. You may have felt anxious. It's very common when people can't form a pattern that the first response is one of mild anxiety. And you may even have felt confused. Now, some of you, when I named it as being a horse and rider, some of you would immediately be able to see the picture. So naming a pattern sometimes helps people see it, but for many of you, you still struggle with it. And in fact, if you're struggling to see that horse and rider, odds are you're going to have a hard time attending to anything I'm about to say. But that leads to the second career perception problem, and I call it ambiguity paralysis. That if you're in a state of ambiguity, you can't see a pattern. The natural inclination is to stop acting on your environment. You see, it doesn't make sense to take actions if you don't know they're the right action. So we tend to back off. We tend to stop acting. Clients in our career work who come in and aren't able to see a clear pattern for their future may have difficulty taking action on all your wise and wonderful suggestions for how to craft the resumes and how to do job searches and the like, simply because they're in a form of ambiguity paralysis, and that is getting in the way. Let's move quickly on to the next one. And for this, I'm going to do a test. It's a common little test. You may have seen this before. If so, you'll do it very, very easily. If you've got an old-fashioned writing stick and a piece of paper handy, I'm going to show you a sequence, and all I want you to do is write down what you think the next figure in the sequence is. Those of you who are very, very good at abstract reasoning, visual spatial perception, and mathematical ability will have no difficulty whatsoever with this. Are you ready? Don't care. Here it is. What's the next figure in the sequence? You have 30 seconds. You've already used more time to complete this than the average person needs. You've had enough time now to complete the next 4 rows of this sequence. Average educational attainment level required to be able to solve the problem, usually somewhere around preschool. So if you haven't gotten past preschool, you may have difficulty with this. If you haven't solved it now, the odds of you ever solving it are really, really slim, but keep working until the end of time, which is, oops, now. So there you go. There you have a microcosm of a career client's experience as they're trying to solve a problem. You may have used some fairly advanced cognitive strategies, like trying to make each figure into a word. My heart, Clover's my something. You may have looked at the bar, bar, no bar, 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 and then think that the next one should have no bar. And you'd be right. Right, if that next one has no bar, wrong about your reasoning. So you're using very complex, higher order thinking strategies to try to solve the problem, but they may or may not be working. And then attached to your attempts to do this often come emotions. There may have been a sense of ambiguities. You tried to figure out what this thing was. Highly likely, you felt either annoyance and or frustration at my gentle clues to help you solve this problem. And you may have felt a degree of self-doubt. You may have had one of those self-observation generalizations that says, I'm no good at this abstract reasoning kind of tests. I always do rotten on these things, so I'm not even going to try. So these emotions are common reactions to attempts to solve a problem. Every one of the gentle little tips I gave you to help you solve the problem was in fact accurate information. But I tend to think of that kind of information as noise in the system. All of our clients have noise in the system. They have people around them, whether it's parents or partners or coworkers or friends, who are giving them these helpful bits of information. And instead of using the information in a way that's helpful to them, it tends to just stimulate a whole series of negative emotions. And really all it takes is looking at the problem from a fresh perspective. And once you look at it from a different perspective, the problem becomes relatively easy to solve. And you will see that all of the clues that I gave you were in fact true. Most people can count to 6. Most preschoolers can count to 6. Most people can count to 6 within roughly 3 seconds. So I gave you true stuff, but I didn't give you helpful stuff. So it's not the quality of the information so much as how and when it's delivered that is so important. And this leads me to the third big career perception problem, and that is the habits of the mind. That's a tendency to form a pattern of perception and behavior that then gets in the way of everything else that we're doing. So there was a pattern of perception, probably a cognitive strategy you used to solve the problem. And then with that came a series of anywhere from mild to rather disturbing emotional responses that interfered with your ability to see the problem in a new way. I'm going to now show you probably the most commonly used picture in all of perception research, and that's the classic young lady, old lady. And I'm sure you've seen this. Many of you instinctively would have been able to see a young lady. A number of you instinctively first saw an old lady, and probably most of you find it easy to flip back and forth between the two. But you may not know why you saw what you saw. So let me show you. If your attention was first drawn to the top half of this picture, you are far more likely to think that you're seeing the profile of a young woman turned over to right shoulder. So this is your first orientation, the first piece of data you attend to. Then when you look at the rest of the picture, you take all the rest of the information and you make it consistent with that first belief. And so because you thought you were seeing the picture of a young woman, this becomes her cheek, this becomes her chin, there's the line of her jaw, she's wearing a red choker collar, and she's wearing a black scoop neck blouse underneath her coat. On the other hand, if for whatever reason your attention was first drawn to the lower half of the picture, you're far more likely to see a nose here, lips pursed together, and a chin tucked into a coat. And then when you take the rest of the data, you make that new information consistent with your anchoring belief. And this is one of the biggest of the career perception problems, jumping to conclusions. The notion that you have a starting point, you form an expectation of what you're about to see, and then you take all the new information you're getting and you compare it with that expectation in order to make it consistent. So you have a starting point, and then all the other data is not used as new data, it's simply used to confirm what you already concluded. Psychologists call that process of pattern formation schema. And the function of schema is to make our thought process so much more efficient. And quite frankly, we'd go nuts if we didn't organize information into schema, because we have so much information constantly coming in that the brain's main job is to filter it out, not to bring it in. As an example of that filtering process, if I ask you to think for the next 5 seconds about your feet, you will suddenly become aware of sensations that before were filtered out. Maybe your feet are a little chilly. Maybe they're warm because you got snuggly socks on and slippers because you don't have to wear tight-fitting shoes at a conference. Whatever, you will become aware of sensations that you were receiving, but just screening out. So information was coming in and you just weren't attending to it. People who don't have this kind of filtering are sometimes called attention deficit disorder, where every piece of new information that comes in gets equal attention. And using schema allows us to routinize core or repeating functions. Think of the first time that you drove to maybe a new work setting. And if you're not familiar with the area, you were hyper attentive to the street signs, to all the noises, everything that's going on around you. And you would have probably been more tired by the time you got there. By the time you've driven that route 100 times, you've routinized it. You don't pay attention to most of the extraneous data. There's a problem. So although it's very helpful to us, there's also a huge career problem with these schema. And that is that the more efficient we get, the less information we seem to need before we make a judgment. And then there's a corollary to that, and that is the more deeply rooted our schema, the less likely we are to see alternative patterns or meanings. So if you have a client that's coming in with an existing idea about self or about the world of work, or about their place in the world of work, they need fewer data points to prove they're right than they need data points to prove they're wrong. You could give them 100 pieces of information, all pointing in a new direction, but the one thing that confirms what they already believe to be true about themselves is the thing that they'll hang on to. It's also very, very difficult to get a person to step outside of their deeply rooted schema. Now, perhaps the best illustration I can think of to show how powerful that effect is would be this. In the recent election, just under half of all Americans that were voting would look at this picture and see the image of a person who is a salvation for the American way of life. And just over half of the American population would look at this and say, this is a picture of a person who will be the death of the American way of life, the destruction of it. And it doesn't matter how much data or evidence is presented. Whatever your starting assumption is, you will then use the information to confirm it, or you'll ignore it or not attend to it. And that's why it's so frustrating if you happen to be on one side of that great divide. You can't even possibly understand how people can't see the rest of the data. That's a mistaken attribution schema problem. And perhaps the largest barrier of all that we face are emotional filters. And Daniel Gilbert had this brilliant comment. He said, we cannot feel good about an imaginary future when we're busy feeling bad about an actual present. So when your clients come in to you for help with their career planning, if they're feeling bad about their present, it's really hard to get them excited about a preferred future. Why? Because they're seeing the process through the filter of the present emotion. Now, emotions can be temporal, the kind of thing that maybe the client was coming in and the traffic was really bad and they ended up being really rushed and 5 minutes late. And so they're feeling flustered when they come in. That's a temporal feeling. But emotions can also be related to a stage within a life role. Some fascinating work was done by the Menninger Foundation when they were examining the experiences of volunteers to the American Peace Corps. And they found that these volunteers tend to go through a fairly predictable cycle. And I have found that this morale curve is a wonderful heuristic. It's not a predictive device, but it helps explain people's experiences within any life role, whether it's a work role, a school role, a relational role. People tend to go through a predictable series of emotional states. To illustrate this, what I'd like to do is use the example of people coming in to a graduate program in counseling psych, because that's an environment I'm really quite familiar with. You'll see on the sidebar that it's depicting changes in emotion. And then as we go along the horizontal line of the graph, that depicts the emotional changes through time. So let's talk about our student entering into their graduate program in counseling psych. And they typically come in with a sense of apprehension. Part of the apprehension is the fear that the program will recognize they made a mistake in admitting the student. The imposter syndrome is running high. Amongst all those qualified candidates, they picked me, they must have made a mistake. But there's also apprehension around things like, will I be able to find the classroom? Will I be able to find my way to the washrooms? What are my classmates going to be like? So when you're apprehensive, you look at your environment through that apprehension so that everything becomes a question that needs solving, and solving quickly. But as you get to know your environment a little bit, you find your way, you tend to replace that sense of apprehension with one of enthusiasm. You get quite excited about your new environment. The student will say, man, I've been waiting so long to get into this. Now I'm finally here. I am so excited. And they will see the entire program, the entire field of counseling through that veil of enthusiasm. Everything looks wonderful. This is where they'll often come up with a thesis idea about how they're going to fundamentally change counseling process for everyone forever. And so my general rule is I never accept a thesis proposal when the student's in that enthusiasm stage, because it tends to be a little unrealistic. The enthusiasm phase tends to get replaced by a feeling of anxiety. And that's when people start to get a little bit nervous about what have I done? What have I committed to? I usually suggest that anxiety for my students sets in when they actually read the course outlines. Now, anxiety can have two components to it. Some forms of anxiety result in questions of what is expected of me. And another form of anxiety results in questions of, can I do what's expected of me? The important piece here is that when people are anxious, the first thing they want is more information. But giving the information doesn't necessarily reduce the anxiety. So when students are asking what is expected of me, I went from 2-page to about 10-page, really descriptive course outlines that explained every bit in full detail. They got all the information. Anxiety wasn't changed one whit, but it was replaced by an anxiety of around, can I do this? I'm not sure I can do this. Soon, anxiety is replaced by disappointment. People will look around and go, oh man, this program isn't as good as I thought it was. I thought this was supposed to be a good university. It sure has its warts, you know. People are just generally feeling disappointed. And fairly quickly, that can lead to a feeling of frustration where they're adding anger to their disappointment. And then they may slip into not necessarily a clinical depression, but slipping into a lack of will to act on their environment. And when people are in this depressing stage, everything looks awful. No matter what you suggest, they'll find a reason why it won't work. So what we have to do is find a way to capture their imagination, to engage them. In school, I call those engagement strategies due dates. So students will look at their course outline. They've got 2 days to get in that assignment. They heave a sigh, pick up their stuff, and start to work on it. And pretty soon, they've changed their emotional space. A couple of points to remember about these emotional reactions. A, it's natural. People go through this in some variation of it. B, if there's no intervention, the cycle repeats. Enthusiasm is less, depression tends to be deeper. C, that these morale curves happen within every one of your life roles, and they're additive. So if you are in a depression point in more than one life role, it's much more debilitating. That's why we tend to say, have multiple things going on in your life so that the enthusiasm stage in one role can counteract the depression stage in another. If you enter this curve by choice, you tend to come in at apprehension. But if it's not by choice, you tend to come in at anxiety. And this is the case with people who've been laid off from work or who are forced to seek assistance. So I know I went through that extremely quickly, but the main point is that people will view whatever they're looking at, whatever they're doing, through the lens of this dominant emotion that's present. And because of that, it will distort what they see in ways that may or may not be helpful to them. And I'd be curious as you reflect on it to see if that resonates at all with your client experiences or with your own. But these typically have an activation cycle, this linking between what you perceive, what you feel, and what you do. Typically follows something like this, where emotions serve to filter what data you're bringing in, which changes what you think to be true, which has an impact on what people do. And what they do gives them different experiences and different sets of feedback. And that feedback has emotional consequences, and the cycle repeats. And if your initial filtering perception, initial emotion that's filtering perception is something like depression or discouragement, then you have a downward cycle because discouragement tends to breed more discouragement. But the liberating thing is that if the filtering emotion is one of hope or confidence, you build a positive change cycle because hope increases behaviors that increase hope. So if that's the activation cycle, what can we do to break the chain? Well, I think career helpers really are all about agents of change. And we have three primary domains that we can work in: what people think, what people feel, what people do. Really important to remember that if you make movement in any one of these domains, you get movement in all of the domains. And another way to look at that is to think of what used to call the holy trinity of counseling intervention, that we can seek to change thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. Often in the career world, we're interested in changing clients' behaviors. We might want to try new actions. We might want to increase the frequency of positive actions that they've used. We might want to create insight, a new belief, a new self-observation generalization, or a new worldview generalization, because that new thought may lead them to be able to try new actions. And the area that we don't spend enough time on is helping clients acknowledge and experience what they are feeling, and then to harness that feeling in a way to help them get to their goal. So I like this quote from David Martin when he talked about evocative empathy, the ability to communicate your understanding of the other person's intended message. And there's a lot in this definition. Clients not only have a message, they have an intended message. We need to get below the surface of what they're saying to see what they intended to say. But that's not enough. We need to just it's not enough that we understand this, but we have to communicate our understanding to our clients. And when we do, we evoke responses, we create responses. So we use empathy to encourage positive actions. So I'm going to quickly give you three interventions that fit within this focus on the affect, focus on behavior, or focus on the thinking patterns, and how powerful it is to start with the emotional state. And it's very, very simple. I indicated at the beginning that I thought emotion work is within career practitioners' scope of practice. It may not be within your scope of practice to dive deep into the source of emotions, to look for emotional trauma and its antecedents and consequences, but it is within your scope of practice to acknowledge it. And here's why that's important. You can do what we call reflecting affect. This is where something is felt or implied but not said. I get a sense of frustration when you tell me that. And then you do a checkout. Is that right? And if you're not sure, then I think you just need to ask, how does that feel? When you tell me you've been out of work now for 3 months, how does that feel? What's it like when you've knocked on 27 doors and haven't gotten any responses? How does that feel? What you do when you name the emotion is you take the elephant out of the room. The elephant only is powerful when it's unacknowledged. So that you name the emotion, you reduce its power as a filter. It doesn't completely go away, but radically diminishes it. But then you start to you harness the emotion. So let's explore the impact of that. How does your feeling of frustration impact you in this process? What's been the impact of that emotion for you? And then the third piece is to harness it. And you ask, so it would be helpful if you could feel less frustrated? Would that be good for you? Or to harness a positive one. So would it be helpful if you could feel even more confident when you're going out? So those are the three pieces: name it, explore it, and the exploration can be very brief, and then harness it. If you wanted to focus on a behavioral kind of a strategy. Weininger was a philosopher that had a huge impact on Alfred Adler, and he talked about acting as if. People might have a self-observation generalization that they can't do something or they can't be something. We often want clients to be more assertive in things like job search strategies. And clients often feel that they are not assertive. But if you ask them to show you what does assertion look like, they can easily demonstrate what an assertive behavior. So instead of asking them to be assertive, we simply ask them to act as if they were. And show me in the office, show me what an assertive person would do. 9 times out of 10, they're able to do that. What it does is it allows people to try a behavior, even if they don't believe they are that behavior, and then experience different feedback mechanisms. That's acting as if. Probably one of the most powerful tools that I use in my practice. The third one is reframing, and this is a cognitive strategy. That's simply taking the same information and reframing it to encourage a new perspective. One young mother, age 28, recently divorced, came to me and indicated that she would love to get into the teaching profession, but from where she was right there, it would take 5 years to get there, and said, I'll be 33 when I'm done the program. The reframing, and this is an old one, but it's a very simple one, was simply, and how old will you be in 5 years if you don't do this? The answer was the same. And so then she reframed her perspective that this might be possible. And then our job was to show how it may be probable, not just possible. So wherever possible, I encourage folks to harness the power of these transformative emotions of hope and confidence. Clients never get anywhere without a strong measure of both of these things. So anything that you can do that names hope and names confidence and builds on that is going to lead to powerful results for your clients. And so there we are with that big, hairy conclusion about the role that perception and emotion can play, and not only in preparing for an unpredictable future, but even more importantly, crafting a preferred future. And if you want to see more about that, this book has just been released by my good friends and colleagues at Septembra. I encourage you to go have a look at that. But I'd like to leave you with a powerful, evocative statement from Amanda Gordon, the Youth Poet Laureate at the Biden inauguration ceremony, who said, "There is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it." I would encourage you to have the courage to be the light your clients need. Thank you so much for your attention. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
All right. Thank you for that, Kris. Fantastic session, as always. Some of these things I've witnessed before, but it's always good. The refresher, and there were some new nuggets, which I appreciate. There's lots of action in the chat. Lots of interesting questions and thought that came through. And also there were some people who were having some technical issues. So I would say to all of you, we apologize, and the session is recorded and it will be made available following the meeting. We do have some time for a couple of questions. There was a few, I've tried to order them, but the first one is, if you're ready, would you say, and this is from Stephanie, would you say apprehension is also a bias, especially when asking and answering question?
Is it a bias? Absolutely. That when you're asking, or when you're posing a question, or when you're trying to answer it, the apprehension can come from imagining where the question is going, right? And so if I'm not sure about where that question is going, as a client, I can feel apprehensive about it, and then that can serve as a filter that distorts how I think about it and then how I answer it.
Thank you. And we have another one here. This one's from Samantha. My question is, what suggestions or tools are there to apply to those 5 problems in young developing minds where picturing a positive future career is difficult when high school students, for example, struggle to move their perceptions beyond current thoughts and feelings?
That's a wonderful question, Samantha. I often use that as an example of one of my favorite exercises to hate in working in career planning for young people. And that is, imagine yourself 30 years from now or 20 years from now, and what are you doing, and what kind of life are you leading, and then let's figure out how we're going to help you to get there. And the reason I hate that is that it's projecting so far into an unrealistic future that young folks almost inevitably roll their eyes and groan and have almost no capacity to be able to answer that question. And so what we need to do is change that timeline from distant future to today. So if you could be doing anything tomorrow, what would it be? And I don't care how realistic that anything is. I can teach the mechanisms of career development and career processes with an unrealistic quote goal just as easy as I can with a realistic one. So if the person comes back and says, I'm going to be a guitar player in a rock band, wonderful. Let's use that and let's harness it. You see, they will capture a current emotion. I'm excited about being a guitar player. I'm not at all excited about being an accountant or whatever the heck it is that mom and dad want me to be down the future. But you can harness that excitement to encourage action. So let's look at how you could understand, what would it take to be a guitar player? I actually had a client that I did that with. Mom was just absolutely terror-stricken that all her son wanted to do was be a rock guitarist. And so I harnessed that instead, and we went out and actually talked to somebody who was in a touring band. And by the time the kid realized how much work that person put into it, on the guitar 10 hours a day, playing gigs at night, and playing in places that nobody had ever heard of. And the biggest realization was how incredibly gifted this guy was on the guitar, and nobody knew him. So the kid felt that if you know, there's this glamour of being a rock guitar player, but by bringing it into the present, capturing his present excitement about it, we were then able to understand exploration strategies. Now he revealed a problem with it. And so then we could say, okay, well, what else could you be looking at? But he now understands how the process works.
I love that example. Yeah, great question. Yeah, and we often talk about, yeah, we don't necessarily need to be constrained by what seems realistic or practical.
Right.
Let's get people moving.
Get people moving, teach process. Career is a developmental process. It's not a destination.
Wonderful. Another question from Lise. I'm thinking about my own emotions and perceptions during the counseling coaching process and the impact they might or might not have. Any thoughts and advice on the impact on what to do with them?
Oh, what another fabulous question, Lise. Absolutely. This is a two-way interaction. Your clients are filled with emotions and perceptions, but you also have emotions and perceptions. And I've had times working with a client where I felt intensely uncomfortable with what the person has been saying, or even I felt perplexed because I cannot see a path forward. How can I help this person? And just as important as it is to acknowledge client emotion, it's important that you recognize your own. Now you'll have a decision point to make. Does this help the client if I share my emotion? Sometimes it does. I almost always share good emotions with them. I'll say, man, I'm so excited at what you're saying right now. I'm really getting this sense of energy from you, right? So I want to convey that to them. And I also will share with them just directly and honestly that, you know, what you've told me has me as perplexed as you. And so I don't see where the answer is, but you know what? I am 100% confident that if we work on this process, I know this process will get us there. So acknowledge it, harness it, work with it.
Wonderful. And we've maybe got about 2 minutes. So I'm just going to give one last question, which I just think is, I think, a good one to end with. I think you can answer succinctly. And this is from Stephanie. Does this presentation tie into what you discussed in your book? Because I'm interested in purchasing it. So there you go. That's a nice,
it does. It was a Reader's Digest condensed version with lots of more examples and descriptors in the book. Thank you. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, I think we will say thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Kris, for a fantastic session, engaging, thought-provoking as always, and pushing us maybe in some areas that we didn't think that were ours to go into. So again, that's much appreciated. And thank everyone for participating and for engaging in the chat. As mentioned, the session will be available fairly soon afterwards, so you can go catch a recorded session. So again, thank you. Okay. And thanks to all the fine folks at CEREC for hosting this session and everything else they're doing. And hope you have a good rest of your day and conference.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks everybody out there. Take care.